The year was 1993, and Paramount Pictures had a bit of a small problem. Star Trek: The Next Generation, the long-running flagship of the franchise, would soon be ending after 7 seasons, leaving only Deep Space Nine to carry on the TV torch. With interest in Star Trek being at an all-time high, it made perfect sense to commission a new, wholly original Star Trek series to keep the party going and the cash flowing. Debuting in 1995, Star Trek Voyager would air until 2001, leaving a legacy of 7 seasons of some of the weirdest Star Trek to ever grace the airwaves.
It's Voyager. Got freaky.
It also resulted in one of the most recognizable designs of a starship not called Enterprise in the entire franchise, as well as a series of model kits that were actually produced by a rival manufacturer. But for reasons I'll talk about later, you might not find them sitting beside each other on the shelves of your local hobby store. Today we're going all the way out to the Delta Quadrant to explore the development of the USS Voyager, and we'll see if we can find out why this ship became the red-headed stepchild of Star Trek scale modeling. So pour yourself a cup of hot coffee.
Coffee. Black.
It's all coming up next on Scale Icons. With The Next Generation heading to the silver screen, Paramount's plans to bolster the franchise by creating a second TV series coincided with their efforts to create a 5th broadcast network in the US. Rather than syndicating the new series like Next Generation or Deep Space Nine, this new series was intended to be the flagship of Paramount's new broadcast network. Now, if you've got a sense of déjà vu, it's probably because this is exactly what happened in 1977, when Paramount planned to launch a new series, Star Trek Phase 2, as the main attraction for its planned TV network at the time. Well, those plans collapsed, and Star Trek Phase 2 evolved into Star Trek the Motion Picture. But this time, however, the United Paramount Network was successfully launched in 1995, and Star Trek Voyager launched with it. But first, Star Trek Voyager was created by Rick Berman, Michael Piller, and Jerry Taylor. Originally airing from January 16, 1995 to May 23, 2001 on the United Paramount Network, this 5th series in the Star Trek franchise spent 172 episodes following the adventures of the USS Voyager as it attempted to return home after being stranded on the far side of the galaxy. Voyager was unique. Not only was it the first Trek series to be on network TV since the original was cancelled in 1969, it was also the first to feature a female lead.
I thought it was Captain Janeway.
Captain Catherine Janeway of the Federation starship Voyager.
It also became the first Star Trek series to use computer-generated imagery for its visual effects. Other sci-fi series of the era like Babylon 5 and Sequest DSV had used CGI to avoid the expense of physical models. But the Star Trek franchise had continued using models because producers felt they were more realistic. Voyager's title sequence was fully CGI from the pilot episode on. But miniatures of the Voyager, its shuttlecraft, and other ships were used for the first 3 seasons. But by the 4th season, CGI began to be introduced, featuring a digital model of the Voyager, created by Robert Bonchoon, a fellow Canadian and friend of the channel. Voyager's development started in the middle of 1993. It was executive producer Jerry Taylor who decided that the new ship should be sleeker and smaller than the Enterprise D. Following this decision, Rick Sternbach, who was then working as senior illustrator and technical consultant on Star Trek The Next Generation, was brought on board to collaborate with production designer Richard D. James in designing this new ship. Now, the Voyager would be the first lead ship that Sternbach designed. Although he'd been responsible for various alien ships and shuttlecraft on the Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, it was his predecessor, Andrew Probert, who designed the Enterprise D. Sternbach's early sketches of the Voyager show a streamlined vessel with a dart-like primary hull, a flattened, elongated engineering section, and swept-back warp pylons. At this point in the process, the ship's size and capabilities were still being worked out. It's worth noting that Sternbach and James weren't the only members of the Star Trek family working on designs for the Voyager. Both Doug Drexler and Jim Martin from the Deep Space Nine art department also submitted several unofficial ideas that were ultimately rejected but would later go on to influence other Star Trek designs. Drexler's low-resolution computer-generated images depicted a long, dart-like primary hull that matched Sternbach's thinking. But this one would later go on to become his starting point for the design of the Vulcan Sirach-class cruiser on Star Trek Enterprise almost a decade later. On the other hand, Martin's hand-drawn sketches show a design lineage with the USS Defiant, a ship he'd designed for Deep Space Nine. Another looked like an updated version of the Oberth class, first seen in Star Trek III. While a third appears to have inspired the Sabre class, seen very briefly in Star Trek First Contact a few years later. This design may have ended up having a major influence on the final look of the Voyager, but more on that in a moment. By early 1994, Sternbach and James had developed a design that was, well, different from the Voyager we know. The lines of the ship were still quite angular, and warp pylons bore a very strong resemblance to Sternbach's earlier runabout design from Deep Space Nine. This design would evolve again, with the primary hull's angular front having been rounded off, the connecting dorsal eliminated, and the shark fins from the early designs making a reappearance. With this iteration, the design of the Voyager had been locked in.
Wrong! It is wrong!
Just as Sternbach was about to produce a final set of blueprints for the filming miniature, Taylor came back and asked if he could make Voyager a little curvier. You know, like a Lexus.
What the hell is going on here?
And while he was at it, maybe add some landing gear too, as they'd also decided the Voyager should be able to land on a planetary surface.
What the hell is she doing?
Making it more like a Lexus actually resulted in that recognizable single smooth hull for the ship. And this is where I think one of Jim Martin's designs may have influenced the final look of the Voyager. Sternbach also came up with a simple landing gear design consisting of single footpads, and eventually adding collapsible toes to help distribute the ship's weight. With the final design having met with producer approval, Sternbach drew up 5 orthographic projections which were then sent to Tony Meininger of Brazil Fabrication and Design for construction of the physical studio model. The model was built out of vacuum-formed plastic and cast resin and featured internal neon lighting. Measuring 155 centimeters long, it was referred to by the production staffers as the 5-foot model. After some 11th hour application of the ship's graphics and decals by Doug Drexler and Michael Okuda, Meininger delivered the model to Image G for shooting on October 19, 1994. However, modifications and detailing would continue for the next 2 months, including a late decision by the producers to have variable geometry warp pylons added to the model, after it had already been built and filming had started. This would require a massive retrofit of this brand new model, with virtually no time to accomplish it.
The hell you will. How the hell can they do that?
One unique feature of the Voyager that distinguished it from all the other Star Trek ships was its windows. Since it would be a significantly smaller ship than the Enterprise D, the windows would appear much larger on TV screens. The model was equipped with tiny still photographs of the interior sets. So rather than typical plain white windows, the audience would get a sense of the interior as the ship moved by in close shots. The model also featured an aft shuttle bay, complete with a detailed miniature set built by Tony Meininger. However, the shuttle bay door was only a removable piece and couldn't mechanically open on its own. This meant that any shot showing it opening would have to be animated. Now, I'd love to show you an example of this, but I couldn't find anything online that wasn't from a video game or a fan creation like this. The Voyager made its television debut on January 16, 1995 in the pilot episode titled Caretaker, which at that time was the most expensive pilot in television history, reportedly costing $23 million to produce. As I mentioned earlier, Voyager aired at a time when huge advancements were being made in computer-generated imagery. Over the course of the first few seasons, physical models were phased out, and digitally created starships entered service. By Season 4 in 1997, Meininger's studio model had become obsolete, and it was eventually sold off at auction in 2006 for over $130,000. So with a new Star Trek full of new starship designs, it was time for AMT, the same company that produced every Star Trek model kit since the original series and was currently selling Next Generation and Deep Space Nine model kits, to swing into gear and tackle Voyager. Or was it?
What's wrong?
Aluminum Model Toys, better known as AMT, had been the original producer of Star Trek models since August 1966, when it first obtained the license. As far as models were concerned, AMT was synonymous with Star Trek model kits. If you've watched either of these two videos, you know just how important AMT was to the success of the original Star Trek. I'll include links to both videos in the description below. In the 1990s, AMT gained the licenses to produce model kits based on the Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. But in 1994, when Paramount was shopping licenses for the upcoming series Voyager, Revell Monogram was able to outbid AMT for the license to produce kits for this new series. For the first time in Trek history, two major model kit producers would be competing with each other for the chance to sell Star Trek models to consumers. Revell Monogram produced a small number of kits while it had the Voyager license. Starting in 1995, they released kits of the USS Voyager itself, Chakotay's Maquis Raider from the pilot episode, and the fan favorite Kazon ship.
Really?
The Voyager kit was in 1/670 scale and consisted of 63 pieces molded in light gray styrene. Accuracy and fit was better than typical AMT Star Trek kits, and it even included folding the cell pylons and transparent parts for the many large windows. However, some details didn't translate to this initial offering. Most notoriously, the clear windows on the upper saucer didn't include dividers. A display stand, as well as a very rudimentary decal sheet that missed several key features, rounded out the kit. In 1996, Revell Monogram released a 3-piece set of these models, scaled down to 1/1400, presumably to compete with AMT's series of similarly sized kits, and totally not because they didn't have any other ship designs under license.
Starfleet is so competitive!
2 versions of this kit hit the shelves. One of these was clearly aimed at new builders, as it included glue, paints, and a brush. The European release of this kit featured different box art and included different brands of glue and paint. Just 1 year later, they released a special, limited edition version of their 1/670 scale Voyager kit. This special edition was characterized by improvements to the original tooling, and now included an additional 7 parts, bringing the total up to 69. Among the many improvements, the upper saucer windows now included dividers. The navigational deflector was now transparent to facilitate lighting, and the shuttle bay could now be modeled open, and a tiny in-scale Type 8 shuttlecraft was even included. The original barely adequate decal sheet was replaced with a new expansive sheet containing 161 individual decals. More than just the usual names and pennants, the new decal sheet now included details such as additional windows, docking ports, lifeboat hatches, and even warning stripes for the phaser banks. Only 20,000 copies of this 1997 special edition were ever released. Did you get yours? And if you were lucky enough to pick up one of these rare kits, you also got an enamel pin. Useful for bragging rights at conventions and model shows. Despite AMT and Revell Monogram going head-to-head with their Star Trek kits, this free market free-for-all wouldn't last long. Some have even suggested that Revell Monogram's acquisition of the license, snatching it away from AMT, was really the canary in the coal mine for the science fiction scale model market of the 1990s. Due to the overall declining health of the model industry at the time and struggling with sagging sales across the board, AMT Ertl abruptly ceased production of all of its Star Trek and Star Wars related kits to save the company money, shortly before being purchased by a company called Racing Champions, which itself would later evolve into Round 2 models years later. Things are not much different for Revell Monogram. It saw its smaller lineup of sci-fi kits, including its Star Trek entries, meet with only a tepid response, and so it decided to get out of the sci-fi business as well, leaving just one major manufacturer, Polar Lights, to keep on mass-producing science fiction models on a slightly smaller scale. Oh, and Racing Champions would buy them too.
All this adds up to a pattern.
Even though the big companies were still feeling the crunch, smaller garage kits were still being produced. And in 2002, Alliance Models released a tiny 1400 scale USS Voyager. Cast in 4 solid resin pieces, the hull, the nacelles, and a base, the model still contained a fair amount of detail. Nacelle pylons could be posed in cruise or warp configuration, detail was crisp, and the decal sheet was actually more expansive than Revell Monogram's original 1995 version. Despite being the smallest version of the Voyager made as a garage kit, this builds up into a beautiful model. In 2004, on the other side of the Pacific, Bandai would release a highly detailed 1/850 scale kit of the Voyager. In typical Bandai fashion, the kit came pre-painted and included an internal lighting system. Nacelle pylons were movable and could be posed in either configuration, and for the first time a set of landing gear was included, as well as a stand that housed the batteries and the power switch. Of course, sci-fi would make an inevitable resurgence in the modeling world, and Star Trek kits came back with a vengeance. Beginning in 2010, Revell Germany, which was Revell Monogram's former European subsidiary, re-released some of the Voyager models, and even later produced new kits from the original Star Trek series, as well as the film Star Trek Into Darkness. Yes, I know, Polar Lights had been producing Star Trek kits since 2003, but we'll get to that in a second. Their 2009 Voyager kit was a re-release of the 1997 Special Edition, but featuring new box artwork. No changes were made to the Special Edition tooling, but the extensive decal sheet was now produced by Cartograph. This same kit would be re-released once more, this time in 2019 with new box art. It was around this time that Revell Germany renegotiated the Star Trek license extension exclusively for sales in the European Union only. But surely with this licensing agreement there was something in place for kits on this side of the Atlantic.
Nothing showing up, Captain.
Unfortunately, there had been no Voyager model kits marketed in the US or Canada since 1997, so the license had expired. It wouldn't be until early 2020 when Round 2 picked up the license for North American distribution of Star Trek Voyager kits. This was an expensive acquisition for the company. Not only did it incur the licensing fee, it also had to create brand new molds from scratch, as the original ones had been turned over to Revell Germany when they renegotiated their license extension. In 2021, Round 2 would release their own version of the Voyager, this time in 1/1000 scale, and in 2 different varieties. Like the majority of Round 2's 1/1000 scale offerings, the Voyager is a snap-together, well, push-together kit. Depending on which version of the kit you're building, most of the 58 parts are either molded in a blue-gray styrene that's similar to the actual hull color of the studio model, or in a translucent white to facilitate lighting for more advanced modelers. The remainder of the parts are molded in transparent styrene. Not surprisingly, these parts are provided for the usual suspects: windows, navigation deflectors, and warp nacelles. A large decal sheet includes some of the larger windows, lifeboat hatches, hull panels, pennants, and other markings. Unlike the larger Revell kit, some of the sensor pallets were not molded in, so decals for these areas are provided instead. Just like the Bandai kit before it, the Round 2 kit also includes landing gear and posable warp pylons. When finished, the kit measures about 35 centimeters long. That's 13.5 inches if you speak American. I spoke with Round 2 brand manager Jamie Hood, who told me that they went with a 1/1000 scale kit rather than a larger kit similar to the Revell offering in order to flesh out their line of Star Trek capital ships in that scale. Jamie also told me that they originally started with the notion that the Bandai kit was a reasonable representation of the ship, but once design work started in earnest, they realized that it was not a reliable reference piece for what they hoped to accomplish. So they worked with their factory engineer to help shape their CAD file to match photos of the filming miniature as closely as possible, given the time constraints that they had. The result is a highly detailed recreation that is a perfect accompaniment to Round 2's 1/1000 fleet of Star Trek ships. So, one final question remains. 2 competitors, 2 products, the same boxes? Well, according to Jamie Hood, this comes down to the style guide provided by Paramount, which sets out the standard for branding graphics. The reasoning for this is so that when all of the various Star Trek merch gets placed on the store shelf, that it all looks harmonious regardless of what company manufactured it, even if licensing agreements seemingly preclude this, at least for the Voyager kits. As to which kit's the best one, well, that's for you to decide. So here's where you get involved. Have you ever built any of these Voyager kits? And if so, what was your experience with them? Which one do you prefer? Comment below, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I read all of your comments and respond when I can. You've been watching Scale Icons, and I'll see you at the workbench.